The morning Grace Rourke pressed her palms flat against the top rail of the cedar fence and stared across the property line at Owen Talbot's wheat field gold and thick and breathing in the Kansas wind like something alive. She had not eaten in 2 days, and she did not once look away from those crops until her eyes burned. It was the spring of 1874, and the grasslands of Sedgwick County, Kansas, were beginning their slow and grudging thaw. The winter had been brutal in the particular way that Kansas winters tend to be brutal, which is to say it arrived without ceremony and departed without apology, and in between it took things from people whether they were ready to give them up or not. It had taken Gerald Rourke in November, 3 months prior, and it had taken most of what remained of the Rourke farm along with him. Not all at once, and not dramatically. Just steadily, the way water finds its way through cracked stone, a little every day until the damage is irreversible. Grace was 28 years old. She had brown hair the color of river mud and gray eyes that people often described as calm, until they looked into them long enough to understand that calm and still were not the same thing. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches in her boots, which were worn nearly through at the left heel, and she had the kind of build that comes from years of hard physical labor, not delicate, not fragile, just honest. Her hands were calloused. Her back was straight. And standing at that fence on a Tuesday morning in late March, watching Owen Talbot's wheat rise in orderly green rows toward the brightening sky, she felt the particular shame of a woman who has run completely out of options but is too proud to say so out loud. She had been watching his crops for 3 mornings in a row. The first morning she had told herself she was checking the weather. The second morning she had told herself she was just walking the fence line. On the third morning she stopped telling herself anything at all and simply stood there, her fingers white on the cedar rail, watching those rows of wheat and thinking about her own field behind her, which was nothing but a tangle of dead grass and cracked earth and broken promise. Gerald had planted it wrong the season before or hadn't planted it at all, depending on which version of the story you believed, and Grace had stopped fighting about which version was true because Gerald was dead, and it no longer mattered what had happened or who had made which mistake. What mattered was the field behind her and the hunger in her stomach, and the fact that her 9-year-old daughter Lily was sitting at the kitchen table this very moment, eating the last of the dried corn they had. Owen Talbot's land sat directly to the east of the Rourke property, separated only by that cedar fence that Gerald had built in 1869, when the two families had still been on decent terms, before the dispute over the water rights to the creek that ran along the southern edge of both properties, before Gerald's drinking had turned his temper sharp and unpredictable, before Owen had quietly and without malice simply become everything that Gerald Rourke had not. Grace knew almost nothing about Owen Talbot as a man. She knew he was 34 years old. She knew he had come to Kansas from Tennessee in 1868, alone, without a wife or family, and had built his farm from nothing with his own hands over the course of 6 years until it was, by any honest measure, one of the finest small operations in the county. She knew he kept 2 draft horses and a small herd of cattle, and that his wheat field, the one she was currently staring at, ran about 40 acres along the eastern edge of the shared fence line. She knew he was tall, broader through the shoulders than Gerald had been, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of face that the sun had worked on for years without managing to make hard. She knew he had tipped his hat to her twice on the road into Wichita, and that both times she had nodded back without stopping because Gerald had not liked her stopping to talk to Owen Talbot. She did not know why, on this particular Tuesday morning, she had come back to the fence a 3rd time. She did not know what she had expected to find. She did not know what she was hoping for. What she found was Owen Talbot himself, 30 yards away, moving down his wheat rows with a hoe, working the early spring weeds from between the stalks. He had not seen her yet. He was moving with his head down, methodical, and there was something about the way he worked, unhurried, thorough, quiet, that made her throat tighten in a way she did not entirely understand. She should have walked away. She knew she should have walked away. Instead, she stood there, and eventually he looked up, and their eyes met across the distance of those 30 yards and all that wheat. He straightened. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the fence, and then he looked past her, at the Rourke field behind her, which even from 30 yards away in early spring was obviously bare and broken and unready for planting. His expression did not change in any way that was readable from that distance. He just looked, and then he nodded, the same way he always nodded on the road into town, just a slight dip of his chin, and he went back to his hoeing. Grace Rourke walked back to her house without saying a single word. She fed Lily the corn and told herself she would figure something out. She told herself she would go into town and talk to Emmett Hale at the feed store about credit. She told herself she would manage. She had been telling herself she would manage for 3 months, and she was beginning to understand that telling yourself a thing and it being true were two different matters entirely. The knock at her door came the following morning before breakfast. She opened it expecting Reverend Caldwell, who had taken to stopping by every few days with a look on his face that she found equal parts kind and insufferable, the look of a man who has decided he understands your situation better than you do. Instead, she found Owen Talbot standing on her porch with his hat in his hand, and the sight of him there unexpected, solid, looking at her with those dark eyes that were serious but not unkind, struck her so suddenly that she had to grip the door frame. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. His voice was low and measured, a Tennessee quality still in it after 6 years in Kansas. "Mr. Talbot," she said. He looked at his hat. He looked back at her. He was not a man who used many words. She could see that about him already, and she found herself strangely grateful for it because she was not, at this particular moment, in a state to absorb a great many words. "I noticed your field," he said. "The east field along the fence." She waited. Her jaw was set the way it got when she was keeping her dignity locked in place by force of will. "I thought if you were willing," he said, "I could plow it for you, get it turned and ready. It's not too late in the season if we move this week." "And what do you want for that?" she said. It came out more clipped than she intended, sharper than the situation warranted, but she was 3 months past her husband's death and 2 days past her last real meal, and the fear in her was sitting right beneath the surface of everything, barely contained. He did not flinch. "Nothing," he said. "I don't want anything for it." "Men don't plow other people's fields for nothing, Mr. Talbot." "I do," he said simply. Not defensive, not hurt, just a statement of fact, offered the way you might state that the sky was blue or the creek ran south. She stared at him. The morning light was coming in low and golden over his shoulder, and behind him she could see his property line where the wheat was already thick and promising, and something in her chest moved in a way that was dangerous, and she shoved it down immediately. "I don't take charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "You're my neighbor. Your field going to waste is a waste of good Kansas land, that's all." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something steadying about the way he stood. He was not trying to make her feel small. He was not pitying her. He was just standing there on her porch offering her something practical and waiting to see what she would do with it. "I don't have seed," she said. It came out quietly, the words costing her something. "I've got seed," he said. "More than I need. Winter wheat and some corn. You can pay me back in harvest if that sits better with you." Something in her softened, almost against her will. The offer of repayment, not charity but trade, the kind of arrangement that left her dignity intact, was the thing that got through whatever wall she had built. "All right," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. "I'll come by tomorrow with the team," he said. He turned and walked back down her porch steps and across the yard toward the fence line, and Grace Rourke closed her door and pressed her back against it and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 months. He came with his team the next morning as promised, 2 enormous gray draft horses that he called Wallace and Chester, pulling his plow. Grace was already in the field when he arrived, wearing her work dress and her worn boots and a kerchief over her hair, because She intended to make clear from the beginning that she was not going to stand on her porch and watch him labor on her behalf. She had gloves and a bucket and she planned to work. He looked at her when he came through the gate, already hitched to the plow, already ready, and something crossed his face that might have been approval but went by too quickly to name. "I'm working too," she said, preempting any argument. "I didn't say otherwise," he said, and clicked his tongue at Wallace, and the horses stepped forward and the plow bit into the earth. She worked behind him, breaking up clods, clearing stones, moving the bucket along. They did not talk much. There was not, she discovered, a great deal of need to talk. He had a rhythm to his work and she fell into it beside him without difficulty, and the hours moved in that particular way that hard outdoor labor makes hours move, where time feels both very long and very short simultaneously. At noon, he stopped and took a biscuit from his coat pocket and offered her half without comment. She took it without comment. They sat on the split-rail fence at the edge of the field and ate the biscuit and looked at the turned earth, dark and rich and smelling of Kansas in spring, which was a smell like beginning again. "Your wheat looks good this year," she said, because she had been looking at it for 3 mornings running and it seemed dishonest not to acknowledge it. "It's been a good winter for the roots," he said. "Not too wet, the freeze wasn't too deep." "Gerald planted our field last fall," she said, and then stopped because what she had been about to say next was complicated and she was not sure it was any of his business. "He didn't do it right," she finished. "Or he didn't do it at all. I'm not certain which." Owen looked at the turned earth and did not say anything. "He was sick," she said, and that was not exactly true, but it was not entirely a lie either. At the end. "I know," Owen said. "I'm sorry for it." There was a long silence. A meadowlark was singing somewhere across the fence in his wheat field, that liquid pouring sound that meadowlarks make in Kansas spring, and Grace listened to it and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. "You knew him," she said. It was not quite a question. "Well enough," Owen said. He was not going to say anything uncharitable about a dead man. She could see that, and she respected him for it even as she recognized the careful maneuvering of it. "He was not always the way he was at the end," she said, because she felt, for some reason she could not entirely articulate, that this man deserved to know that. That she deserved to say it. "I expect not," Owen said. They sat a little longer. Then he stood and she stood and they went back to the field. It took 3 days to plow and prepare the whole field. 3 days of working together from early morning until the light gave out, with the horses and the plow and the hand tools, and by the end of it Grace's shoulders ached in a way that felt purposeful and good, the ache of work that means something, and the field behind her house was ready for seed. He came back on the 4th day with the seed corn and the winter wheat in burlap sacks in his wagon, and she was waiting for him with coffee, which was the first time she had offered him anything, and he took it and held the tin cup in both hands and drank it in the cool morning air without making any ceremony of it, which was the right way to accept a gesture like that. "How much do I owe you?" she said. "When harvest comes." "We'll settle it fair," he said. "Don't worry on it yet." She wanted to press the point, because she wanted the terms clear, because unclear terms were how people ended up beholden in ways they had not agreed to. But something in his straightforwardness made her trust that when harvest came he would be fair. She did not entirely understand why she trusted that, given that she barely knew him. She filed the feeling away to examine later. He showed her how to plant the corn rows at the right depth and spacing, and she did not pretend she already knew when she did not, which seemed to please him in a quiet way. He showed her how to read the soil moisture, how to space the winter wheat so the roots would have room to establish before the summer heat came. He had a patient way of explaining things that was not condescending, just clear, the way a person explains something when they genuinely want the other person to understand. Lily came out to the field in the afternoon of that 4th day. She was 9 years old, dark-haired like her father had been, with her mother's gray eyes, and she stood at the edge of the planted rows and looked at Owen Talbot with the frank assessing stare of a child who has learned to be cautious around men. "Are you the man from next door?" Lily said, "I am," Owen said. "Mama said you were helping us plant." "We're helping each other," he said. "Your mama's been working harder than I have." Lily considered this. "Can I help?" He looked at Grace. Grace nodded. He spent the next half hour teaching Lily how to press the corn seeds into the prepared earth at the right depth, 2 fingers down, and Lily did it with the intense concentration of a child doing something real, something that matters, not just play, and Grace watched the two of them moving along the row together, the big, dark-haired man and her small, serious daughter, and felt something move through her that she had no name for and was not ready to name. By the end of the week, the field was planted. He came back 3 days later, not to work but just to check the moisture and look at the rows, and Grace was out there already, looking, and they stood side by side in the field, and neither of them said very much, but neither of them left quickly either. "You have family in Tennessee?" she asked, because the silence was comfortable enough that a question felt natural rather than intrusive. "A sister," he said. "She married a man named Fowler. They're in Nashville. Do you miss it?" He thought about this seriously, the way he seemed to think about most things. "Sometimes," he said, "less than I thought I would. Kansas gets into you." "It does," she agreed. "I was born in Missouri. We came here when I was 12. I didn't want to come. I thought Kansas would be nothing." She looked at the horizon, that enormous flat Kansas sky going every shade of blue from deep to pale. It turned out to be everything instead. He was looking at the horizon too, and she could feel him beside her, the warmth of him in the cool spring morning, and she was acutely aware of how long it had been since she had stood next to another adult in a comfortable silence and simply looked at the sky. "What was your wife like?" she said, and then immediately regretted the question because she did not know if he had ever had a wife, and it was presumptuous and also possibly tender ground. "Never had one," he said without any weight in it. No bitterness, no sorrow, just a fact. "Came close once back in Tennessee. She married someone else. It was the right thing." "You believe that?" "Eventually," he said, and a small dry humor moved across his face for just a moment, gone almost before she caught it. She laughed, a short surprised sound, the first time she had laughed and she could not remember how long, and the sound of it in the open air of the field startled her. Owen looked at her and something in his eyes shifted, became warmer, and he looked back at the horizon quickly, and she looked back at the horizon quickly, and they both pretended nothing had happened. But something had happened. They both knew it. They stood there for another few minutes, and then he said he needed to get back to his own field, and she said she had bread to start, and they separated to their respective properties with a care that was, if they had been honest with each other, slightly excessive. April moved into May. The corn began to show. Little green shoots, tentative at first, then more confident, pressing up through the turned dark earth in the rows that she and Owen and Lily had planted. And Grace stood at the edge of her field in the mornings before the rest of the day began, and watched those shoots come up and felt something she recognized, distantly and carefully, as hope. Owen came by most mornings, for one reason or another. There was always a practical reason: checking the drainage on the south end, adjusting the scarecrow, returning a hoe he had borrowed, and Grace accepted these reasons at face value, because accepting them at face value was easier than thinking about what might lie beneath them, and she was not yet ready to think about what might lie beneath them. She began to leave coffee out for him, just the pot on the porch rail, when she heard his horses early in the morning. He would take a cup and leave the cup on the rail when he was done, and she would find it there when she came out, still warm sometimes, and the simple domesticity of it. The pot on the rail, the cup left behind, occupied a corner of her mind that she refused to examine directly. In town, on Saturday mornings when she took the wagon in for supplies, she became aware that people had noticed Owen Talbot's truck to her property. Wichita in 1874 was not yet the cattle boomtown it would become in the later years of the decade, but it was a real town with real streets and a real network of gossip, and Grace Rourke's name was being spoken alongside Owen Talbot's in the dry goods store and the post office and the parlor of Mrs. Whitfield, who made it her business to know everyone else's. It was Nora Haynes who brought it to her directly, because Nora had been Grace's closest friend since 1871 and believed that direct was the kindest way. She caught up with Grace outside the feed store on a Saturday in early May and fell into step beside her. "People are talking," Nora said. "People talk," Grace said. "About you and Owen Talbot. He's helping me with my field. He's my neighbor." "Grace," Nora said with that particular patient tone, "he goes to your property every day. He goes to check the field, the crops. It's practical." Nora was quiet for a moment. They walked. The main street of Wichita was busy, wagons and horses and people, the smell of sawdust and manure and the faint sweetness of something baking somewhere. "What do you feel?" Nora said, not accusatory, just asking. Grace stopped walking. She looked at the street ahead of her, at the people moving past, at a dog sleeping in a patch of sun outside the saloon. "I don't know yet," she said, honestly. Nora linked her arm through Grace's. "Gerald has been gone 4 months," she said. "You're allowed." "I know I'm allowed," Grace said. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" Grace looked at her friend. "I'm thinking about my field," she said, "and whether it will hold, and whether the corn is spaced right, and whether I can make the harvest cover the seed debt and still have enough for next season." She paused. "That's what I'm thinking about." Nora nodded, not entirely believing this but kind enough to let it stand. The corn did hold. Through May it grew steadily, and Grace watched it the way she imagined Owen watched his wheat, with a proprietary attention, a daily inventory of its progress, a constant assessment of what it needed. She had not grown crops before, not really, not in charge of them, and the experience of watching something you have planted from seed push itself toward the sky was unexpectedly profound. One evening in late May, Owen stopped by later than usual, after the workday was done, as the sky was going orange and red in the west. He came to the porch and she was sitting on the steps with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, and he stood at the bottom of the steps and looked at the field and the way the last light caught the green shoots. "It's going to be a good crop," he said. "Because of you," she said. "Because of the work we both did," he said, "and because of the land." She looked at him in the last of the evening light. He had his hat in his hand again, the way he had the first morning he came to her door, and she noticed that his hands were very steady and that there were fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into Kansas sun, and that he was looking at her field with something that looked very much like pride and care. "Owen," she said, and the use of his first name was unplanned, came out before she had consciously decided to say it, and she saw him go still just slightly at the sound of it. "Yes," he said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it. Not just for the plowing, for how you did it, for not making me feel small about needing it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not small, Grace," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name too, and there was a stillness after it, a silence that had weight. She looked at him. He looked at her. The meadowlark was singing again somewhere in the darkening wheat field, and the sky was doing extraordinary things with the last of the light, and Grace Rourke felt, for the first time and she could not say how long, that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be standing. "Would you want to come in?" she said. "For supper?" "If you have no other plans." He looked at the house, he looked at her. "I'd like that," he said. He came inside and sat at the kitchen table while she cooked, and Lily came down from her room and sat across from him and interrogated him about horses, specifically about Wallace and Chester, whom she had been fascinated by since the plowing days. He answered her questions with complete seriousness, as though her opinions on draft horse management were genuinely valuable, and Lily bloomed under this attention in the way that children bloom when adults treat them as though they matter. Grace made salt pork and cornbread and green beans from the last of the cellar stores, and Owen ate with appreciation and without awkwardness, and they talked around the table the way people talk when they are finding their way toward each other, with care and curiosity, the conversation moving through the safe territories: crops, horses, the town, the coming summer, and occasionally touching the borders of less safe territories, and then moving away again. After supper, Lily fell asleep on the settle and Grace carried her up to bed, and when she came back down, Owen was washing the supper dishes, which she had not expected and which stopped her in the kitchen doorway. He looked over his shoulder at her. "Hope that's all right," he said. "It's all right," she said. She picked up a dishcloth and dried what he washed, and they stood at the kitchen basin together in the lamplight, and she was very aware of how close they were standing and of the particular domesticity of this moment and of how entirely natural it felt, and that naturalness scared her more than strangeness would have. He left shortly after. At the door he paused and looked at her in that steady, serious way he had. "Grace," he said, and then seemed to reconsider whatever he had been about to say. "Good night," he said instead. "Good night, Owen," she said. She closed the door and leaned against it and pressed her hands to her face and breathed until her heart settled. June arrived with heat and the particular merciless brightness of a Kansas summer, and the corn grew tall and the wheat across the fence grew gold, and the days fell into a rhythm that Grace both relied on and was slightly afraid of relying on. Owen was there most mornings. She began to cook extra at supper, not every night but often, and there was always enough on the table if he happened to come by in the evening. He began to bring things: a new hinge for the barn door that he noticed was failing, a sack of flour from town when he went on Wednesday and she couldn't make the trip, a book of poems that he pressed into her hands one evening without explanation, a collection of verse by somebody named Tennyson that turned out to have a much-handled look to it, the spine creased and familiar. "Did you read it?" she asked. "I did," he said. "In Tennessee. Here," he said, "winters get long." She read it in the evenings after Lily was in bed, by lamplight, and she thought about him reading it in his own house across the fence in the long, dark Kansas winters, and she thought about how odd and specific it was that of all the people in Sedgwick County, this particular quiet, steady man was the one whose company she looked forward to each morning with an anticipation she was no longer even attempting to pretend was merely practical. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know when you have already been falling for some time and only just looked down and realized how far. It was not the dramatic, sudden love of novels. It was something that had been growing in the dark like her corn, quietly, steadily, finding its way toward the light. But she did not say anything, because she was a widow of 6 months, and because she had a daughter to consider, and because Owen Talbot had not said anything either, and she was not sure enough of what she was seeing in him to risk the alternative. A wrong move here would cost her more than her dignity. It would cost her him, and she had come to understand that losing him would be a different kind of loss than any she had known before. It was Emmett Hale who forced the issue, as these things so often are forced by a third party with no intention of being useful. Grace was in the feed store in the second week of June when Emmett Hale, who was a decent man but a tireless talker, leaned across the counter and said, in the confidential tone of someone about to say something not confidential at all, "Heard you've been spending a good deal of time with Owen Talbot." "He helped me with my field," Grace said. "More than that, by the sound of it," Emmett said, with a smile that was meant to be genial and landed somewhere between nosy and presumptuous. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'm here to buy flour." She bought her flour and left with her chin up and her jaw tight, and on the way home in the wagon she turned the conversation over and looked at it from every angle, and what she found was that she was not angry at Emmett Hale for noticing. She was angry at herself for not being able to decide what she wanted the truth to be. That evening Owen came by at sunset the way he sometimes did, and they sat on her porch steps with coffee, which had become a habit that neither of them had formally agreed to but both of them participated in, and the corn stood tall in the field and the sky was going every color at once, and Grace looked at her hands around the coffee cup and said, "Emmett Hale thinks we are keeping company." Owen was quiet. "He's not wrong," Owen said at last. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, his jaw working slightly the way it did when he was choosing words carefully. "I think about you," he said. "More than a neighbor ought to, perhaps. More than a man helping with a field ought to." He turned and looked at her. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you deserve honesty." Grace held her coffee cup and felt her heart beating in her ears. "I think about you too," she said, quietly. Just a fact, offered the same way he had offered his. He looked at her. Something in his face that had been held carefully in place shifted, relaxed, became something she had not seen in it before, not the steady, measured practicality she associated with him, but something more open, more uncertain, more human. "I don't want to push you," he said. "You've had a hard year. You're still finding your footing, I know that." "You're not pushing me," she said. "I don't want to be just the man who plowed your field." The directness of this, the plain, vulnerable honesty of it, moved through her like warm water. "Owen," she said, and she turned to face him on the step, "you have not been just the man who plowed my field since approximately the third morning I found your coffee cup on my porch rail." Something happened to his face then, something that she would later, privately, categorize as the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face, which was the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has been suddenly told he does not have to carry it alone anymore. He reached out and covered her hand with his, where it sat on her knee around the coffee cup. His hand was large and warm and rough with work, and she turned her hand over under his, and he held it, simply, there in the evening light with the corn growing and the meadowlark going quiet for the night. And neither of them said anything else for a long time because nothing else needed saying. Nora Haynes came out to the farm 2 days later, ostensibly to bring a jar of preserves and incidentally to find out if what she had heard was true, and Grace told her what had happened on the porch steps, and Nora set down the jar of preserves and hugged her, and Grace let herself be hugged, and Nora said, "Oh, thank God, I've been waiting for you to admit it for 2 months." And Grace laughed in that same surprised way she had laughed in the field. Things changed and did not change. He still came in the mornings. She still left coffee on the rail. But now when he came to the door, he was sometimes invited in for breakfast, and he sat at the table with Lily, who had decided she approved of him completely and without reservation, which Grace had suspected would be the case, and which, if she was honest, had been part of what had held her back. The knowledge that if Owen Talbot sat often enough at her table, her daughter was going to love him, and that that love would be a responsibility. Owen understood this. She watched him understand it in the deliberate, unhurried way he had with Lily, patient, attentive, not attempting to replace anything, not overclaiming any territory, just being present and reliable and consistent in a way that a 9-year-old who had watched her father deteriorate over 2 years and then disappear entirely found deeply, quietly reassuring. One Saturday in July, he took Lily to see the new foal at the Brennan farm 2 miles south, because she had asked about it 7 times, and because he had business with Tom Brennan anyway. And Grace watched them drive away in his wagon, the big quiet man and the small serious girl. And she stood on the porch in the morning sun and felt something so large and so uncomplicated that it frightened her slightly. The way only the things you most want to keep can frighten you, by the simple fact of their existence. He had told her his history by then, in pieces, across all those mornings and evenings. Tennessee farm family, 3 brothers and the sister. The war he had fought for Tennessee, for the Confederacy, a fact he offered straightforwardly and without pride, as a piece of history rather than a point of identity, and she could see in his face that it was something he had thought carefully about in the years since, in the particular way that men do when the cause they fought for turns out to be on the wrong side of history. He did not ask forgiveness for it. He did not expect absolution. He just told the truth of it and let it sit. She respected him for that more than she could easily explain. He had come to Kansas, he told her, because after the war Tennessee felt like a place he had left something in that he could not get back, and he wanted to be somewhere that had no memory of him, somewhere he could build from nothing and have the building be purely his own. Kansas had offered him that. 6 years of hard work and the farm was what it was, good, solid, his. He had what he needed. He had said, one evening, quietly and without fanfare, that the only thing he had found himself lacking in all the years of building was someone to build it with. Grace had looked at him when he said that, and he had looked back at her, and neither of them had pretended the statement was abstract. In August, when the corn was high and starting to tassel, and the wheat field across the fence was deep gold and ready for harvest, two things happened in close succession that defined the rest of that summer. The first was that a man named Roland Cutler, who owned a large cattle operation north of town, came to Grace's farm on a Wednesday afternoon with a proposition. Roland Cutler was 45, wide through the middle, with small eyes and the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no often enough to take it gracefully. He had been sniffing around the Rourke property since shortly after Gerald's death, and Grace had heard from Nora that he wanted to buy it. He sat in her kitchen and drank the coffee she offered because it would have been rude not to, and laid out his offer, which was reasonable as offers go but which was not what she had worked for, and she listened with her hands flat on the table and her back straight and said when he was finished that the property was not for sale. He pushed, not rudely but persistently, the way men push when they believe a woman's resistance is merely an opening position. He said the land would be hard for a woman alone to work. He said the prices he was offering were above fair. He said that surely she could see the practical wisdom of selling, taking the money, and settling somewhere in town. "Mr. Cutler," she said, "the land is not for sale." He left unhappy about it, and Grace stood at the kitchen window and watched his horse and buggy move down the road and felt something fierce and clean in her chest, the satisfaction of a woman who has decided what she will and will not give up. She told Owen that evening. He was quiet when she told him, and she could see him calibrating something, deciding how much to say. "Cutler won't stop at one offer," he said. "I know," she said. "Let him make 100 offers, the answer doesn't change." He looked at her. "You're going to be all right," he said. "The farm is going to be all right." "I know that too," she said, and she did. She knew it in the way you know things when you have watched your own crops come up out of the earth you planted, and you have stood in the field in the morning and counted the stalks and run the math, and understood that you have done something real. The second thing that happened in August was more important. Owen came to the fence on a Saturday morning. Grace was at the fence too, on her side, looking at the corn, which was close enough to harvest that the silks had gone brown and the ears were full. He was on his side, and he leaned on the top rail of the cedar fence, and she leaned on the top rail of the cedar fence, and they were 2 feet apart, separated by the cedar and the property line, and he looked at her in the serious, unhurried way he had. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at his hands. He looked at the corn. He looked at her. "I have been thinking about the future," he said. "My future, your future, whether those might be the same future." Grace's heart was doing something complicated. "I'm asking you to consider me," he said. "As a husband. I know it's been less than a year since Gerald. I know you're still finding your way into yourself again, into what you want. I'm not asking for an answer right now. I'm asking you to consider it." He paused. "I love you, Grace. I think I have since about the 3rd morning I saw you at this fence, watching my crops and not saying a word about it." She stared at him. Her eyes had gone wet in a way she had not anticipated. "How did you know it was the 3rd morning?" she said. "Because I saw you the first 2, he said. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make you feel caught. But I saw you. And I saw what you were looking at and what it meant that you wouldn't ask for help, and I thought, that is a person worth knowing." She pressed her lips together hard to keep herself together and failed anyway. Tears came down, not dramatically, just a few, and she did not try to hide them. "You don't have to answer now," he said gently. "Owen," she said. "Yes. I love you too," she said. "I've known it since May, I think, maybe earlier. I'm terrible at admitting things to myself." She laughed through the tears. "Yes," she said. "I'll consider you. I'll more than consider you. Yes." He looked at her from across the cedar fence rail with that expression she had named the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. And then he moved around the fence post to her side, and she moved toward him, and he put his hands on her face and kissed her, there at the fence, with the corn tall around them and the September sun coming and the meadowlark singing in his wheat. It was a good kiss. A very good kiss. The kind of kiss that answers questions. They pulled back and looked at each other, still very close, and she laughed again because she kept laughing at the wrong moments and he was smiling. A full real smile she had never quite seen on him before, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought she would spend considerable time for the rest of her life finding reasons to make him smile like that. "There's Lily to think about," she said. "There is," he agreed. "She needs to be part of it. She needs to understand what's happening. She's had enough things happen to her without warning." "Of course," he said, "whenever you think the time is right." Grace thought about Lily and the trip to see the Brennan foal, and the way her daughter had come home that Saturday sitting straight and pleased beside Owen in the wagon seat, already trusting the size and steadiness of him. "I think the time might be soon," she said. It was the first week of September when the corn was harvested. They brought it in together over 3 days, Owen and Grace, and on the last day, Nora Haynes' 2 older boys who Owen hired for the afternoon, loading the wagon in the hot September sun, the ears dry and heavy in their hands. And by the end of it the corn was in the barn and Grace sat on the side of the wagon and looked at it and felt something she could only call profound and could not adequately describe. Owen sat beside her on the wagon and said nothing, just sat with her, which was exactly right. "We need to talk about the seed debt," she said. "Grace," he said, "we said we'd settle it fair at harvest. I want to settle it." He looked at the barn full of corn. He looked at her. "The debt is settled," he said, "more than settled. I want it to be fair." "I know you do." He picked up her hand. "It is fair, trust me." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. The harvest satisfied her more than she had expected. The winter wheat she had planted in the east section came up strong, and the corn filled 2 full wagon loads that Owen took to the mill in Wichita for her while she managed the farm, and when he came back with the money she stared at it in her hand for a long time. "That's more than I expected," she said. "Good prices this season," he said. "Is it enough to plant a full field next spring?" "It's enough to plant 2, he said. She closed her fist around the money. "All right," she said again, differently than she had said it before. Not resignation. Resolution. The word of a woman who has decided she is going to be all right and now has the evidence to believe it. She talked to Lily on a Sunday afternoon in late September, while they were shelling dried beans at the kitchen table, and the light was coming in the window all golden with the last of the season. She told her daughter that Owen Talbot had asked if she would marry him, and that she had said yes, and that she wanted Lily to know before anything else happened, and that Lily's feelings about it mattered more to her than anything else in the world. Lily shelled a bean, then another, then she said, "Does he want to live here or at his farm?" "We haven't decided that yet," Grace said. "We'd figure it out together, all 3 of us." Lily shelled more beans. "His horses are better," she said. "His farm is larger," Grace agreed. "He has more room," Lily said. "And his barn doesn't have that problem with the roof." "The roof is being repaired," Grace said. "Still," Lily said, with the pragmatic tone of a 9-year-old who has absorbed a great deal of adult practical thinking by osmosis. She looked up at her mother. "I like him," she said. "I liked him from the beginning. He talks to me like I'm not a baby." "He does," Grace agreed. Lily went back to the beans. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Grace said. "When?" Lily said. "We haven't decided." "Before the winter," Grace looked at her daughter. "Probably," she said, "if we can arrange it." "Good," Lily said. "His house is warmer. Tom Brennan's boy said his house is better insulated." Grace laughed so suddenly and so hard that she had to put the beans down, and Lily looked at her with mild puzzlement and then, reluctantly, began to laugh too. Both of them at the kitchen table with the beans in their laps and the afternoon light coming in gold, laughing at nothing and everything. And Grace thought this was probably the best she had felt in years, maybe longer. She told Owen that evening about the conversation, specifically about the part regarding the horses and the barn roof and the insulation, and Owen stood in her kitchen doorway, and laughed the same way she had laughed, surprised, full, real. And she thought again about making him do that, and about the rest of a life spent in the attempt. They were married on the 14th of October, 1874, at the Methodist Church in Wichita, in a ceremony attended by Nora Haynes and her husband, Emmett Hale, who came largely out of curiosity, but was also genuinely fond of both of them. Reverend Caldwell, who performed the ceremony with a satisfaction that suggested he had been expecting this since approximately March, and a handful of other neighbors and town people. Lily stood beside Grace in a blue dress that Nora had helped sew and held a small bunch of late-season wildflowers, and looked at Owen through the entire ceremony with the earnest, evaluating expression of a child who is taking the permanent attachment of a new adult to her family very seriously. Owen stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was dark and fit him well, and when Grace came down the aisle in the cream-colored dress she had worn at her first wedding, which was the only good dress she had, and which she had altered at the neckline to feel less like wearing the past, he looked at her the way he had looked at the corn in the barn, with deep, quiet satisfaction. The look of someone who has worked carefully for something important and arrived at the moment when the work becomes the reward. He said his vows in a clear, steady voice. She said hers, looking at his face the whole time, not at her hands, not at the floor, at his face, because she had decided when she walked down the aisle that whatever she said in this church, she was going to say it looking directly at him. When it was done, and Reverend Caldwell had done the ceremonial clearing of his throat and declared them married, Owen kissed her in the church in front of the assembled Wichita onlookers, and she let him. And somewhere behind her, she heard Nora quietly crying with happiness and Emmett Hale saying something to the man beside him, and Lily's voice, clear and matter-of-fact, informing the Haynes children that she had known this would happen since July. They had a supper at the church hall, nothing elaborate, broad-dish style, the way these things were done on the Kansas frontier in 1874, with cornbread and smoked meats and apple pie and coffee, and a small celebration that felt exactly right to the occasion, not too large for what it was but warm enough to be a real marking of something real. That night, driving back to Owen's farm, which was now their farm, the Rourke property locked up for the winter with plans to work it from the adjacent Talbot land in the spring, Grace sat on the wagon bench next to Owen with Lily leaning against her half asleep, and the stars were enormous over the Kansas plains, the way they are in October when the air has gone clear and cold, and Owen held the reins with one hand and held her hand with the other and said nothing, and she said nothing. And there was not a single thing in the world that needed saying. The farmhouse was large enough, as Lily had correctly noted, and warmer than the Rourke house, and the three of them moved through the adjustment of shared space with care and humor and occasional negotiation. Lily took the east bedroom and declared it superior to her previous room. Owen moved his desk from the main room into the corner of the bedroom to make space for Grace's sewing table. They argued once mildly about where to hang the kitchen shelves, and Owen lost, and the shelves went where Grace wanted them, and he was gracious about it, and she was amused by his graciousness and told him so. Winter came, and it was a different winter than the one before. There was enough food in the cellar. There was wood for the fire. There was a man who came to bed in the evenings and lay beside her in the dark and talked about the spring planting with the same quiet, detailed attention that she had come to understand was his way of showing that he cared about something, and she lay beside him and listened and talked back and felt, in the deep, unremarkable way of real contentment, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. There were difficulties. There are always difficulties. Roland Cutler came back in December with a revised offer on the Rourke property and was dealt with by Owen and Grace together, standing side by side at their front door, with a clarity and firmness that left him very little ambiguity about the permanence of the answer. He left annoyed and did not come back, and the Rourke property, which they would work in the spring as part of the extended farm, remained theirs. The water rights dispute that had existed between the two properties dissolved naturally once they were a single household. Owen had been the more reasonable party in the original dispute, and Grace knew it, and she told him so, and he said the creek ran the same no matter who owned the banks, which was a thing she wrote in her mind alongside the other things she had catalogued about him to return to in the evenings. February brought a blizzard that kept them inside for 4 days, which should have been miserable and instead was not, because there were cards and books and conversation, and the particular luxury of being genuinely comfortable in a confined space with the people you love. And on the second night of the blizzard, Lily taught Owen a card game of her own invention with rules that changed unpredictably, and Owen played it without complaint for 2 hours, and Grace watched them from across the table and thought about how much had changed in 11 months, and how all of it somehow had been for the better. Spring came again, the spring of 1875, and they began the season's work. This time both farms were in play, Owen's wheat fields and the Rourke East field, and a new acreage they broke together on the south side of the Talbot property. 60 acres between them that they planted in corn and wheat, and at Lily's insistence, a small kitchen garden of beans and squash, and a row of sunflowers that she chose and planted entirely herself. Owen taught Grace things about the farm she had not known before. She taught him things about managing a household on tight margins that surprised him in their ingenuity. They argued sometimes about methods, and sometimes about timing, and sometimes about small daily things that were not really about the things they were arguing about. And they resolved these arguments the way people resolve them when they are fundamentally well-suited, by listening, by conceding when they were wrong, by not carrying resentment past the day it started. In April, Grace understood she was expecting a child. She told Owen on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee between them and the window light coming in, and he went very still and then looked at her with an expression that she would spend considerable time over the following months failing to adequately describe, except to say that it was the look of a man for whom something important and long-awaited has arrived. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. "How do you feel?" he said. "Well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, but well. We'll manage the work differently," he said. "I'll take over the Owen," she said. "Yes. I'm having a baby. I'm not unwell. We'll manage the work sensibly." He looked at her. "Right," he said. "But thank you," she said, "for wanting to," she told Lily the following week. Lily received this information with the focused calm of a child who has been a single child for 9 years and is now being presented with a fundamental alteration of that condition, and Grace watched her process it and waited. "A boy or a girl," Lily said. "We don't know yet," Grace said. "We won't know until it arrives." "When?" "November, probably," Lily considered. "A baby needs quiet in the early months," she said, with the authority of someone who has read this somewhere and decided to make it her position. "I will be quiet." "You don't need to be that quiet," Grace said. "I will be appropriately quiet," Lily said, revising. "That sounds right," Grace agreed. The summer of 1875 was warm and generous, the kind of Kansas summer that reminds you why people came to this difficult, beautiful place in the first place. The wheat came in heavy, and the corn was good, and the kitchen garden was somewhat wild but productive. And Lily spent hours in the sunflower row she had planted, appearing there regularly with a proprietary air, and Owen watched her tending it with an expression that Grace had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was feeling something large, and was not quite sure how to accommodate it. Nora came out to the farm in July with the news that Emmett Hale was taking a second wife, a woman from Topeka who was reportedly very organized, and they sat on the porch and talked all afternoon the way women talk when they have known each other long enough to say the true things. And Grace told Nora about the baby, and Nora cried again, and Grace did not cry but held Nora's hand while she did. "Are you happy?" Nora said. "Really, really," Grace said. "More than I thought I would be again. More than I think I deserve sometimes." "Don't say that," Nora said firmly. "I don't mean it the way it sounds," Grace said. I mean, I didn't expect this. I didn't plan for it. I came out of the worst year of my life and somehow it turned into, she looked at the farm, the golden field, the barn, the kitchen garden, the fence between the two properties that was no longer really a boundary because everything on both sides of it belonged to them now. This, she finished. Nora squeezed her hand. You stood at that fence, she said. I stood at that fence, Grace agreed. And you said nothing. I said nothing, Grace said. I was too proud to ask. And he saw you anyway. He saw me anyway, Grace said, and smiled at the fence line, at the memory of standing there those 3 mornings in March with her hands white on the cedar rail and her stomach empty and her field dead behind her, watching those wheat rows breathing in the wind and not asking for what she needed. He saw exactly what I wasn't saying. August was hot and the work was full and good, and in the evenings they sat on the porch, Owen and Grace, after Lily was asleep, and watched the summer dark over the flat Kansas land and talked or did not talk, and it was good either way. She was visibly pregnant by August, moving more slowly through the days, and he was attentive without being hovering, which was a line she had told him she needed him to walk and which he walked with characteristic precision. She found him one afternoon in the barn looking at a cradle he had been building from the cedar wood of the old fence posts, the ones that had defined the boundary between their properties, which he had replaced with new posts when they combined the farms. That's the fence, she said. Was the fence, he said. He was sanding the piece in his hands, looking at it carefully. She looked at the cradle. It was simple and beautiful, solid wood, smooth. You made that from the fence between us, she said. He looked at her. It seemed right, he said. She reached out and touched the wood, the cedar grain, and thought about standing on one side of this same wood and watching him across it and being too proud to say what she needed. Cedar that had been a boundary becoming a cradle. She pressed her lips together. Owen, she said. Don't cry, he said gently. You'll make me feel terrible about it. I'm not crying, she said, crying slightly. Right, he said, and came over and put his arm around her in the dim warmth of the barn, and she leaned against him and looked at the cradle. It's beautiful, she said. It'll do, he said, which was his way of saying he was proud of it. September moved in and out. October arrived with the harvest, the second harvest of their marriage, and it was larger and better than the year before. Owen hired 2 men from town to help bring in the wheat, and Grace managed the operation with an authority that made Owen watch her across the field with something between admiration and amusement. And when all of it was in, and the accounts were settled, they had more than they had spent, which was not always the case in farming, and which they acknowledged with quiet satisfaction over supper. Roland Cutler had started buying land on the other side of town and left them alone. The water in the creek ran clear and steady. Lily was doing well in the school in town, which she rode to with the Haynes children 3 days a week, and she had recently distinguished herself by correcting the schoolteacher, Mr. Farnsworth, on a matter of geography, and had been correct in doing so, a fact which Owen had received with barely concealed delight. The baby came on the 2nd of November, 1875, in the warmth of their bedroom, while the first light snow of the season fell outside the window, and it was a boy. A big, healthy, clear-lunged boy who announced himself to the world with an impressive volume that startled even the midwife, Mrs. Oakes, who had attended a great many births and claimed to be unsurprised by anything. Lily, who had been waiting in the main room with Owen through the long hours of the labor, appeared in the bedroom doorway when it was over and looked at the baby in Grace's arms with the expression of someone confronting something unexpectedly large. He's loud, Lily said. He is, Grace agreed. What's his name? Grace looked at Owen, who was standing beside her holding her hand and looking at his son with an expression that was not describable by any word she had in English. We thought Daniel, she said. Daniel Owen Talbot. Lily came closer and looked at the baby. The baby looked back at her with the unfocused dark gaze of the newborn. Daniel, Lily said, testing it. All right, Grace said. "He can stay," Lily said, with the generosity of a child granting formal approval, and Grace laughed, which she was getting used to doing when she was in the middle of large feelings, and Owen laughed too, the same surprised, genuine laugh, and the baby startled at the sound of it and blinked his dark eyes. Winter settled in around them. The farmhouse was full and warm. Lily helped with the baby with a serious diligence that delighted everyone who saw it. Owen was the kind of father who is not afraid of the physical reality of infants, who takes them without hesitation, walks them in the dark of the night when they won't settle, sits with a sleeping baby on his chest in the chair by the fire with the same quiet, patient attention he gave to everything he cared for, which was one more thing Grace added to the internal catalog she had been keeping of this man since March. She watched him one night, sitting by the fire with Daniel asleep on his chest, his big, rough farmer's hand spread across the baby's back, and she thought about standing at the fence 11 months after this moment with her hands white on the cedar rail, and she thought about all the distance between that moment and this one, all the ground she had covered to get here. And she thought about how it had all started with a field she could not plant, and a man she had been too proud to ask for help, and the fact that he had seen what she wasn't saying anyway. She sat down next to him on the settle, and he shifted to make room, and she leaned her head on his shoulder and looked at Daniel sleeping on his chest, the baby's face in the firelight, small and perfect and serious even in sleep. "Owen," she said. He said quietly so as not to wake Daniel, "You plowed half your wheat under." He was quiet for a moment. "It was already established," he said. "It would grow back." "You plowed half a planted wheat field under to give me room for my corn," she said. "I never asked you about it directly, and you never offered to explain it." "What is there to explain?" he said. "Most men would have waited," she said. "Most men would have let me ask." "You weren't going to ask," he said. "I was not," she agreed. He turned his head slightly, pressing his cheek to her hair. "I saw you at that fence," he said, 3 mornings, standing there looking at the wheat, not asking, not going away, just standing there like you were trying to find a way to turn what you were looking at into what you needed." He paused. "You needed the field, I had the field. That was a simple enough arithmetic." "It was not simple," she said. "You sacrificed your crop." "I sacrificed some of my crop," he corrected, "and I got much better things in return." She lifted her head and looked at him in the firelight. He was looking at the fire, his face quiet and warm, Daniel's small chest rising and falling under his hand. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. He looked at her. "Considerably." She laughed softly, mindful of the sleeping baby, and he smiled at her in the firelight with the full open smile she had catalogued from the beginning, and she settled her head back against his shoulder, and the fire cracked and the wind moved around the corners of the house, and the cedarwood cradle waited in the bedroom, and outside the Kansas night was huge and quiet and full of stars. The spring of 1876 arrived and found them ready. 65 acres between the two properties, winter wheat well established in the Rourke East field, seed corn stored in the Talbot barn, Daniel 4 months old and already attempting, according to Lily, to engage in deliberate conversation. Owen broke new ground on the south quarter in March, and Grace was there with him, not plowing but walking the turned rows, thinking about the season, planning what would go where. Daniel slept in a sling that Nora had made, tied to Grace's front, and occasionally opened his eyes and looked at the sky with the expression of someone being shown something for the first time that they have strong opinions about. "What do you think?" Grace said to Daniel, who was looking at the wide Kansas sky with considerable intensity. "He approves," Owen said from behind the plow. "You can tell that. He looks like you when you're deciding something," Owen said. Grace considered this and chose to take it as a compliment. Lily turned 10 in April, and Owen gave her a horse. Not a full horse, a young mare, 3 years old, brown and white, that he had been watching at a farm north of town for 6 months and negotiated carefully for, and he brought her home on Lily's birthday morning tied to the back of the wagon. And Lily stood on the porch and looked at the horse and then looked at Owen and then looked at the horse again in the way a person looks when they are trying to determine whether something is real. "For me," she said. "For you," he said. "If your mother agrees." Grace, who had been part of the planning for 3 months, said, "Your mother agrees." Lily named the horse Cora and spent the next 4 Saturdays learning to handle her with Owen's instruction. And she took to it with the same intense, focused competence she brought to everything she decided mattered. And by June, she was riding Cora across the fields with a confidence and ease that made Owen watch her with the particular expression he wore when he was feeling something large. The harvest of 1876 was the best yet. 90 acres between the two properties, corn and wheat and a small barley field Owen had tried for the first time. All of it brought in by early October in weather that cooperated in a way Kansas weather only does when it wants to remind you why you put up with it the rest of the time. They hired 3 men for the wheat, and Grace managed the operation again with the authority that was now simply how she was. And when it was over, they sat on the porch in the evening with coffee and looked at the full barn and the field stubble golden in the evening light and said very little. "We should plant the Rourke North Quarter next season," Grace said. "I was thinking the same thing," Owen said. "And fix the water run on the south end." "Before winter," he agreed. Daniel, sitting on the porch steps between them, was industriously pulling the laces out of Owen's spare boot, which was his current project. Lily was somewhere with Cora in the field, the two of them a moving shape in the last of the light. "Owen," Grace said. "Yes," he said. "Are you happy?" she said. The same question Nora had asked her. He looked at her. He looked at the field. He looked at Daniel destroying his bootlace with earnest satisfaction. He looked at Lily's shape moving through the field on her horse. "Yes," he said, simple, unambiguous, the most certain he had ever sounded about anything. "Really?" she said. "Really?" he said. And then, because he was Owen Talbot and he believed in being precise. Considerably. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. The meadowlark was singing in what was now their wheat field, the combined field that ran along the old fence line, and the Kansas sky was doing its impossible evening things. And somewhere in the near field Lily called something to Cora, and the horse's hooves moved in the soft, turned earth, and Daniel got the bootlace free and held it up in triumph. "Accomplished," Owen said, looking down at the boy. Daniel waved the bootlace. "He has your determination," Owen told Grace. "He has your patience," she said. "He worked on that for 40 minutes. Owen laughed quietly, and she felt the warmth of it against her side where she was leaning against him, and the evening moved around them, the stars beginning their slow appearance, and the farm settled into the particular stillness of a place that has been worked hard all day and is resting now, satisfied, ready for tomorrow. Inside the house, on the mantel above the fireplace, there was a photograph they had taken in town in the summer. The 4 of them outside the photography studio on Douglas Street, Grace and Owen and Lily and Daniel, who had been unimpressed by the experience but who had stayed still long enough. It was not the most flattering portrait anyone had ever taken, but it was honest and real, and Lily had decided it was her favorite object in the house, and Grace agreed with her assessment. Below the photograph on the mantel was a small piece of cedar wood, smooth and pale, a remnant from the cradle building, which Grace had kept without telling Owen until the day he noticed it and looked at her inquiringly, and she said, "The fence," and he had nodded, understanding. The fence that had become a cradle. The boundary that had become a beginning. The cedar rail she had pressed her palms against 3 mornings in a row in late March 1874, watching a man's wheat grow golden and thick in the Kansas wind, and not saying a single word about what she needed, and the man who had seen her anyway, and had plowed half of what he had earned to give her the ground she needed to start again. She thought about it sometimes, not with the old weight of those early months, the shame of the empty field, the hunger, the fear of being a woman alone at the edge of failing, but with something more like wonder. The way a thing that looks like an ending turns out, if you wait, to be the strangest and most improbable kind of beginning. The way a person can stand at a fence not asking for what they need and have someone on the other side see them anyway clearly without being asked, and decide to act. Owen had said it was simple arithmetic. She needed the field, he had the field. But she had come to understand in the years since that it was not arithmetic at all. It was something rarer than that. It was a man who looked at a woman who was too proud to ask and saw, not the pride, not the stubbornness, not the difficulty, but the person beneath all of it. The real, intact, capable person who was simply trying to hold on to something that mattered and decided that person was worth meeting. She had been worth meeting. She had come to believe that. It had taken some time. The autumn stars settled over Sedgwick County, over the Talbot farm and the Rourke field and the stubble of the harvest and the full barn, and the cedar cradle in the bedroom and the photograph on the mantel. Owen put his arm around her on the porch and she leaned into him, and Daniel fell asleep on the porch steps with the bootlace clutched in his hand, and Lily came riding in out of the dark field on Cora, easy and confident, and swung down at the fence and walked the horse to the barn with the assurance of a girl who knows where she is and knows it is home. "Time for bed," Grace called. "One more minute with Cora," Lily called back. "That's what you said 20 minutes ago," Owen said. A pause. "She needed the company," Lily said with dignity. Grace and Owen looked at each other in the dark. His face was in shadow, but she knew exactly what expression was on it, that barely contained humor that she had learned to recognize in the slight movement of his mouth. And she pressed her own mouth together to keep from laughing and failed, and Owen laughed too, and Daniel stirred on the steps without waking, and Lily appeared at the barn door and looked at them both with long-suffering patience. "What's funny?" Lily said. "Nothing," Grace said, composing herself. "Everything is fine," Owen confirmed, not very convincingly. Lily looked at them with the expression of a 10-year-old who suspects she is being managed and has decided to allow it. "I'm going to put Cora in," she said, with the dignity of someone making a considered decision. "Then I'm coming in for supper." "That's the right order of operations," Owen said. Lily disappeared back into the barn. Grace laughed again, quietly, and Owen pulled her closer, and above them the Kansas stars burned enormous and close and cold and permanent, and the farm breathed around them in the quiet good dark, and everything was, at last, exactly as it was supposed to be. On a morning in the spring of 1877, Grace stood at the fence again. The same cedar fence, the same east field, but the world around it entirely changed. The Rourke field behind her now planted and full of green winter wheat shoots pressing up through the turned dark earth. The Talbot field ahead of her bursting with new corn. The fence between them no longer a border, but simply a line in a landscape that belonged to both of them. Daniel was on her hip, pointing at something in the wheat with the intense, focused attention of a 15-month-old who finds all phenomena equally astonishing. Owen was 40 yards away moving down the corn rows with a hoe, his back to her, and he had not seen her yet. She stood at the fence and watched him work and did not say anything, for the old pure pleasure of that familiar shape against the Kansas morning, the wide sky behind him, the corn at his knees, the 2 gray horses in the far paddock. She had stood here before not knowing what she needed and not knowing how to ask. She stood here now knowing exactly what she had, and knowing it was more than she had let herself imagine in those cold, hungry March mornings of 3 years ago. Owen stopped moving. He straightened. He turned and looked at her across the field, across the corn, across the distance and the morning. He smiled. She saw it from 40 yards away, that full, open smile. She smiled back. Daniel said something imperious and emphatic, as though formally announcing the morning on behalf of all interested parties. "Tell him your father is 40 yards away and could stand to move faster," Grace said. Daniel considered this and then repeated his proclamation, presumably adjusted for the new information. Owen had started walking toward her through the corn. She waited at the fence, the way she had waited before, but different now. Her hands loose on the cedar rail, her field full and green behind her, her son in her arms and her daughter somewhere in the farmhouse getting ready for school, and her husband walking toward her through the spring corn with his hat pushed back, and his eyes warm and the whole long, good, ordinary life of them laid out ahead like the Kansas land, vast and particular and full of everything that matters. He reached the fence. He leaned on the rail. He was close enough that she could see the gray at his temples, the lines the sun had made, and she thought he looked, if anything, better than he had the first morning he came to her door with his hat in his hand, better and more known and more hers. "Standing at my fence again," he said. "It's our fence," she said. "It is," he said. Daniel made a commanding sound and reached both arms toward Owen, who took him over the fence rail with the easy practice of a man who has been catching this particular person for 15 months, and held him against his shoulder, and Daniel immediately grabbed his collar and peered over it at the corn with deep satisfaction. "Field looks good," Grace said. "Better than last year," Owen said. She looked at the corn. She looked at her own field behind her. She looked at the farmhouse visible from here, the wide porch, the morning light on the windows, the smoke from the kitchen stove where Lily was probably making a mess of the biscuits she had decided she could make herself. "Owen," she said. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me back then, at the fence." He looked at her, steady, warm, everything she knew about him in his face. "Thank you for standing there," he said, "long enough for me to notice." She reached across the fence and took his free hand, the one that wasn't holding Daniel, and held it in both of hers, and the meadowlark started up in the wheat somewhere close, the same meadowlark. She liked to think, the one that had sung that first spring, although she knew that was sentimental and could not confirm it. It sang its liquid pouring song into the wide Kansas morning, and she stood at the fence holding her husband's hand with her son on his shoulder, and the fields of their life growing green and full around them, and there was nothing left unfinished, nothing left unresolved, nothing left standing at any distance between them at all. The biscuit smoke from the kitchen grew noticeably more urgent. "Lily," they said simultaneously, and looked at each other and went home.